In the year 604 BC, King Nebuchadnezzar took Daniel into captivity in Babylon. His captivity began 18 years before Nebuchadnezzar returned to Jerusalem and leveled it, ending the Davidian monarchy, destroying the temple, taking Judah into exile. And in the second year of Nebuchadnezzar's reign, and this is still 17 years before that destruction of Jerusalem that I was speaking of, we read in Daniel that the king had a dream. In his dream, he saw an image, an idolatrous image with a head of gold, arms and chest of silver, thighs of bronze, feet of clay. And he told his astrologers and wise men, you know the story, he tells his astrologers and wise men, he says, tell me my dream. Not only does he want them to tell him the meaning of the dream, but he can't remember what the dream was. So he says, tell me my dream and give me the interpretation or I will cut you to pieces. No one could except for one Judean named Daniel. The king says to Daniel, whose Babylonian name was Belteshazzar. Now, this is a true thing. My name is also Daniel. I'm named after Daniel of the Bible. When I was working the maintenance crew at an apartment complex, the other guys on the maintenance crew, being biblically literate, they would call me Belteshazzar for short. So the king says to Belteshazzar, are you able to make known to me the dream which I have seen and its interpretation? And Daniel answers before the king. He says, and we can read this in Daniel 2:26. You don't have to turn there, but that's where it is. He says, as for the mystery about which the king has inquired, neither wise men, conjurers, magicians, nor diviners are able to declare it to the king. However, there is a God in heaven who reveals mysteries. And he has made known to King Nebuchadnezzar what will take place in the last days. This was your dream and the visions in your mind while on your bed. Then Daniel goes on to describe this image of empires. You can read it for yourself when you have time. We're not going to work through all of the text right now, but just, to summarize, the head of gold is Babylon. He says, you, O Nebuchadnezzar, are that head of gold. The arms and chest of silver represent the Medo-Persian Empire. Daniel tells Nebuchadnezzar, another kingdom will arise, inferior to yours. And that's exactly what happened. The historical record tells us. The thighs of bronze stand for the Greek Empire, which was established by Alexander the Great. Daniel says, a third kingdom, one of bronze, will rule the whole earth. And that's what happened. The legs and feet of iron and clay are the fourth kingdom, the Roman Empire. As Daniel says, he says, it is strong as iron, inasmuch as iron crushes and shatters all things, so like iron that breaks in pieces, it will crush and break all these in pieces. Now this last kingdom of iron and clay is seen, Daniel, or Nebuchadnezzar actually, saw this with 10 toes. We're explicitly told it had 10 toes. Why is this a necessary detail? Isn't it enough to say it had feet? We could imagine the toes. The prophet goes on, or the prophecy goes on to explicitly tell us that the 10 toes represent 10 kings. And this corresponds to 10 horns. Start to sound familiar. In chapter 7 of Daniel, we have to compare these two things right now, these two images, this image and this dream. In chapter 7 of Daniel, Daniel sees a vision himself this time. And in his vision, he sees 4 beasts. The first beast is a lion with eagle's wings, which we later learn is Babylon. The second beast is a bear, which, following the same progression, is Persia. The third beast is a leopard. Following the same progression, it's Greece. And then he sees a 10-horned beast, which he doesn't even try to describe. It's just the beast with 10 horns. And this would correspond to Rome. There's a clue in that for you when you get to the book of Revelation. You're puzzling over who is the beast, what is the beast. This is where you should be looking. Daniel 7:23 says this regarding the beast. The fourth beast will be a fourth kingdom on the earth, which will be different from all the other kingdoms, and will devour the whole earth and tread it down and crush it. As for the 10 horns, out of this kingdom 10 kings will arise, and another will arise after them, and he will be different from the previous ones. So, of this fourth and terrifying empire, Daniel says, are you in Daniel 7? You might want Daniel 7. He says, after this I kept looking in the night, and I beheld this fourth beast, dreadful, terrifying, extremely strong. It had large iron teeth. The 10 horns of the iron beast that he sees correspond to the 10 toes of the image. Does that make sense? I think so. And they are kings, just as in the book of Revelation. This isn't out on a limb or anything. This is just fairly straightforward. So, therefore, the idolatrous image in Nebuchadnezzar's dream represents these 4 human empires spanning a period from the end of the Judean monarchy, 600 BC, up to the 10th emperor of Rome. The 10th king of Rome, as it were. Nebuchadnezzar, who destroyed Jerusalem in 586 BC, is the head of gold. He is the Babylonian that begins the imagery of the idolatrous image. The 10 emperors of Rome are the 10 toes that finish the image. So, just go with me here now. All right? If we start counting with the first Roman emperor and count them off, we have an amazing result, okay? First one, Augustus, Tiberius, Gaius, Claudius, Nero, number 5. Paul and Peter's bane. Galba, Otho, Vitellius, the 3 that followed in quick succession, Vespasian, and number 10, Titus. This is beyond coincidence. Titus. What is Titus renowned for? Titus, the 10th emperor, was the general who destroyed Jerusalem and the temple in the year 70 Common Era. The image that began with the destroyer of Jerusalem spans nearly 700 years and ends with the destroyer of Jerusalem. That's the power of biblical prophecy. However, in this vision, the dream that Nebuchadnezzar had, if you remember, the idolatrous image he's not depicted as the victor. Rather, he's the victim. Because in his dream, Nebuchadnezzar saw a rock strike the image and shatter it. And then the rock grew to fill the whole earth. This rock is generally understood to represent the kingdom of heaven. You remember where it strikes the image? In the feet. In the feet, and shatters them. What's interesting about that is that the declaration of the kingdom of heaven, which begin with the message of Yochanan the Immerser, this John the Baptist, started in the first toe. The master was born in the first toe under Augustus. Then the declaration of the kingdom of heaven with John the Baptist, and then the master's own ministry in the second toe, Tiberius. The age of the apostles in the third toe, Gaius, Claudius. The fourth toe, and the fifth toe, Nero. And the faith grew and grew and grew and continues to grow to this very day. It is the nature of biblical prophecy to be vague, ambiguous, slippery, subject to various interpretations, And really the prophecies of Daniel, they also can be that way. But there are certain elements in the book of Daniel that are astounding in their level of accuracy, such as what we just saw, the 4 empires of Nebuchadnezzar's dream, the 10 toes. Another amazing example of this level of detail and prophetic clarity is the description of the days of the Maccabean revolt and the Hanukkah revolution. Daniel chapter 8 begins with the words, "In the 3rd year of the reign of Belshazzar, the king, a vision appeared to me." Now, Belshazzar, the king, is the king who would see the handwriting on the wall. He sees the handwriting on the wall that only Daniel could interpret. He was the last king of Babylon before the empire was toppled by the Medes and the Persians. So his 3rd year was about 550 BC, some 18 years after the destruction of Jerusalem. It's been 35 years since Nebuchadnezzar had his dream of the statue. And in that year, Daniel has a vision. He says, "A vision appeared to me, Daniel, subsequent to one which appeared to me previously. I looked in the vision, and while I was looking, I was in the citadel of Susa, which is in the province of Elam. And I looked in the vision, and I myself was beside the Ulai canal. Then I lifted up my eyes and looked, and behold, a ram, which had 2 horns, was standing in front of the canal. Now the 2 horns were long, but one was longer than the other, with the longer one coming up last." Later on, we don't have to guess about this, because later on, the angel Gabriel comes and tells him what it means. The ram represents the joint Medo-Persian Empire. Its capital, as we know from the story of Esther, the capital of Persia, is Shushan, or Susa, same city. One horn of the ram is longer than the other. Well, it's the Medo-Persian Empire, but the power of the Persians, which came up later, is greater. So the longer horn represents the Persians, the shorter one, the Medes. But as Daniel continues to describe this vision that he had, he sees a goat with a single horn come charging from the west. And this goat that comes charging up, it's like a unicorn, it's got a single horn. This goat that comes charging up from the west gores and tramples down this Medo-Persian ram. And we learn the interpretation to this from the historical record, of course. The goat is the Greeks, and the single horn, the goring horn, is Alexander the Great. Because in the year 336 BC, Alexander the Great swept across the Mediterranean world, took over the world, including the Middle East, and the Persian Empire toppled before him. In verse 8, we read about Alexander the Great. It says, "Then the male goat magnified himself," or graded himself, "exceedingly. But as soon as he was great, as soon as he was mighty, the large horn was broken." In the book of Daniel, he's not called Alexander the Great, he's Alexander the Goat. It says, "As soon as he was mighty, the large horn was broken, and in its place there came up 4 conspicuous horns toward the 4 winds of heaven." What does this mean? When Alexander was at the height of his power, he became deathly ill. Still a very young man. And knowing that he was about to die and he had no heir, he summoned his 4 greatest generals and divided his kingdom among them. Macedonia and Greece went to his general by the name of Antigonus. Thrace and Asia Minor went to Lysimachus. Babylonia and Syria went to Seleucus, hence the Seleucids. And Ptolemy inherited Egypt and the land of Israel. In the vision that Daniel has, the 4 generals are represented by these 4 prominent horns that come up after the single horn is broken off. The 4 horns come up towards the 4 winds of heaven. Because after Alexander's kingdom was divided, after Alexander dies, his kingdom is divided between these four generals. And then the Ptolemies and the Seleucids, as I was telling you in the last session, fall to war with each other, and the poor little land of Israel is caught in the middle between them. It becomes a strategic pawn in their battles. Generations later, generations after Alexander, Antiochus Epiphanes arises as the leader of the Seleucids. And yet, way back here in time, Daniel foresees even this happening. He sees him coming up as a little horn, arising out of one of the goat's four prominent horns. You can read this in Daniel 8, beginning in verse 9. It says, "Out of one of the four horns came forth a rather small horn, which grew exceedingly great toward the south, toward the east, and toward the beautiful land. It grew up to the host of heaven and caused some of the host and some of the stars to fall to the earth, and it trampled them down. It even magnified itself to be equal with the commander of the host." Remember, he declared himself divine. "And it removed the regular sacrifice from him." Remember, he put an end to the daily sacrifice in the temple. "And the place of his sanctuary was thrown down. And on account of transgression, the host will be given over to the horn along with the regular sacrifice, and it will fling truth to the ground and perform its will and prosper." This is Antiochus that Daniel is speaking of. It goes on. "Then I heard a holy one speaking, and another holy one said to that particular one who was speaking, 'How long will the vision about the regular sacrifice apply, while the transgression causes horror, so as to allow both the holy place and the host to be trampled?' And he said to me, 'For 2,300 evenings and mornings, then the holy place will be properly restored.'" 2,300 evenings and mornings. What does this mean? What we saw happen here was the little horn took away the daily sacrifice, flung truth to the ground, and then there's to be 2,300 evenings and mornings until the sanctuary is rededicated. Now, what's happened in the past, some interpreters who have not had a proper understanding of the temple service have assumed that this meant 2,300 days, which, by logical inference, they took to mean 2,300 years. It's not really logical. It's being sarcastic. By this reckoning, they anticipated Messiah, the second coming of Messiah, in the mid-19th century. Sold their property, went and waited for him. He didn't come. But what was the question? Was the question, how long until Messiah comes? No. The question was, how long will the vision about the regular sacrifice apply? And he said to me, 2,300 evenings and mornings, then the holy place will be properly restored. It's about the regular sacrifice, which in Hebrew is called the tamid. We learn about it in Exodus chapter 29, beginning in verse 38. "This is what you shall offer on the altar, 2 one-year-old lambs each day continuously. The one lamb you shall offer in the morning, the other lamb you shall offer at twilight," it might say in your Bible, but in Hebrew it really says this. It says between the evenings, bein ha'eravim. And so because of that, because one is called morning and one is called eravim, evening, they're referred to respectively as the morning sacrifice and the evening sacrifice. There shall be a tenth of an ephah and so on. With the one lamb, the other lamb you shall offer at twilight, evening, between the evenings, and shall offer it with the same grain offering, and so on. It shall be a continual burnt offering, or another way to say that, a regular sacrifice throughout your generations. This is the most basic component of the temple worship service. It's what the daily liturgies are based on and so on, is the regular sacrifice. So what you see is there's one in the morning and one in the evening. Right? Therefore, 2,300 evenings and mornings don't refer to 2,300 days. They refer to 2,300 regular sacrifices at a rate of 2 a day. Morning lamb and an evening lamb. It's sacrifices being counted, not days. Thus, it would have actually equaled 1,150 days, which is 3 years and 2 months. So let's take a look at this. We don't have an exact date for when Antiochus actually stopped the daily sacrifice, but we know that it was sometime in the year 168 BC. We know this because it was the 15th day of the month of Kislev of that same year, 168 BC, that he set up his idol, the abomination of desolation, in God's temple. It says so in the book of Maccabees. We are also told that the first hog was sacrificed to it on the 25th day of the same month in the year 168 BC. And we also know that 3 years later on the 25th day of Kislev, in the year 165 BC, the Maccabees cleansed and rededicated the temple. This is nothing short of amazing. So the Maccabees cleanse and rededicate the temple 1,105 days after the idol is erected. Now we don't know, we aren't given a date for when the daily sacrifice, in the book of Maccabees, we're not given a date for when the daily sacrifice ceased, but we can figure it out. 1,150 days, 3 years, 2 months prior to the rededication of the temple. The meaning then is that there were 2,300 daily sacrifices that had been omitted during the period of the temple's desecration. In the book of Daniel, the angel Gabriel goes on further in his explanations to Daniel to describe this little horn that comes up as a stern-faced king. In chapter 11, he speaks of long years. He describes in amazing detail long years of warfare between the Ptolemies and the Seleucids. It's remarkable. If you follow the historical record and compare it with the book of Daniel, you can find you can even find Cleopatra in here and so on. And of course, the machinations of one he calls a despicable person. Let's read Daniel chapter 11, beginning in verse 31. It says, "Forces from him will arise, desecrate the sanctuary fortress, and do away with the regular sacrifice." We've already seen this. "And they will set up the abomination of desolation. By smooth words he will turn to godlessness those who act wickedly toward the covenant. But the people who know their God will display strength and take action. Those who have insight among the people will give understanding to the many, yet they will fall by the sword and by flame, by captivity, by plunder for many days. Now when they fall, they will be granted a little help, and many will join them in hypocrisy. Some of those who have insight will fall in order to refine, purge, and make them pure until the end time, because it is still to come at the appointed time." You see, the events, what we're reading are the events of the Hanukkah Revolution described in these prophecies. The amazing level of detail that we're reading about, though, isn't really meant for us. This isn't for us. I mean, it's good for me. It's good for us. We should be able to read this and we should be able to look at the historical record and say, wow, look at that. That's prophetic. Daniel wrote that before it happened. How did he know that was going to happen? God told him that. And that should strengthen your faith. It strengthens mine. But it's not for me, really. Who's it for? It's for the Maccabees. They were reading this. They were reading these words. Can you imagine them reading these words? Reading these prophecies, saying, could this wicked king be the little horn spoken of by the prophet Daniel? Could we be that generation that is spoken of? They found themselves in the words of the Scriptures. What's that like? Yeshua spoke of a second abomination that causes desolation. He told his disciples, therefore, when you see the abomination of desolation which was spoken of through the prophet Daniel standing in the holy place, let the reader understand. I want you to notice that he speaks of this. He speaks of these things from Daniel as if they haven't happened yet, but in fact they had happened, and yet had not. Because although the prophecies regarding the abomination of desolation had certainly been fulfilled, we saw them fulfilled in living color in the book of Maccabees and the Hanukkah revolt, the book of Daniel also has prophecies regarding another little horn. And this one's found in Daniel chapter 7. I want you to remember that as we're studying the little horn, Antiochus, the little horn of Daniel chapter 8, of Daniel chapter 11 that we've been looking at, this guy came out of the horn of Greece. He came, remember the Alexander the Great, the single horn is broken off, 4 prominent horns came up, and out of one of those horns came the little horn, Antiochus. He came from Greece. In chapter 7, a little horn arises from another place. The little horn of chapter 7 arises from among the 10 horns of the terrifying beast of Rome. He is an 11th horn, like an 11th toe. And he follows in the pattern of Antiochus. In traditional eschatology, I mean traditional Christian eschatology, he's identified with Antichrist and the beast, and rightly so. Regarding this beast, the 11th horn, the angel Gabriel says this. He says, he will speak against the Most High and oppress his righteous ones and try to change the set times and the laws. The righteous will be handed over to him for a time, times, and half a time. If you're going to recognize this person, you have to know his agenda. The new little horn, the new abomination, one of the things he sets out to do is to change the appointed times. What are the appointed times? The appointed times are God's holy days. The Hebrew word is moedim. Now here in Daniel, we're reading in Aramaic because Daniel's written in Aramaic, but it corresponds to the Hebrew moedim. Passover, that's unleavened bread. Shavuot, that's Pentecost. Yom Teruah, that's the Feast of Trumpets, or Rosh Hashanah. Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement. And Sukkot, the Feast of Tabernacles. These are God's appointed times. The agenda of the little horn is to change them, to introduce his own appointed times. I want you to see an interesting thing here. Do you notice how God's Moedim, his appointed times, fall on one side of the calendar, beginning in the spring? There's this empty period in the summer. There's no festivals in the summer, but then they're all lumped again in the fall. And so they're like, if you look at the calendar as a circle, they're on one side, whereas our traditional holidays all fall on the wrong side of the year. Now, of course, there's crossover with Easter and Passover. Isn't that odd? The story of Hanukkah is the story of light growing in the darkness. I'm going to tell you a true thing. This is a true thing. You can measure it against history. Wherever there are people of Torah, there is darkness trying to snuff them out. History proves it over and over again. But this is also a true thing. There's a corollary. The light is not diminished. It grows. The story of Hanukkah is the story of a war between these two worldviews, that of Hellenism and that of Torah. Hellenism, we've learned, Hellenism is the language of humanism. It is the language of philosophical theology. It's the language of relativism. Torah is the language of theism, of mitzvot, deeds, and revelation. And this battle that began back then, it's still going on today. In fact, as far as the body of Messiah goes, I feel like the Hanukkah revolution is just starting. And you're a part of it. Because if we look honestly at ourselves and measure ourselves against God's law, against the Scriptures, we have to admit that we're a lot like Israel in the days of the Maccabees. Our people, our pulpits, have been thoroughly Hellenized. With Greek thought, Greek philosophy, Greek theology, Greek values, Greek mythology. These are all characteristics so deeply rooted among us from the church fathers on down, through church history, into our seminaries. I mean, just as an example, you go to seminary, 2 biblical languages you could choose from. Which one is mandatory? We've been thoroughly Hellenized since the earliest centuries of our existence, since the apostles died, like Israel in the days of the Maccabees. And I would go on to suggest to you that as a temple, because as believers, as followers of Messiah, that's what we are. We are the temple of the Holy Spirit. As a temple, we've also been defiled. This was happening even in the days of Paul. This is not a new thing. In the days of Paul, the spirit of Antichrist, the spirit of false Messiah, was at work among the church, among the believers. In Daniel 7:25 it says, "He will speak against the Most High, oppress his righteous ones, and try to change the set times and the laws. The righteous will be handed over to him for a time, times and half a time." But listen to the words of the Apostle Paul in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2. He says, "Let no one in any way deceive you. It will not come," that's the end. "The end will not come unless the apostasy comes first, and the man of Torahlessness, the man of lawlessness, Torahlessness, is revealed, the son of destruction, who opposes and exalts himself above every so-called God and object of worship, so that he takes his seat in the temple of God, displaying himself as being God. Do you not remember that while I was still with you, I was telling you these things?" This is Paul. Paul himself said so. He calls the false Messiah, he calls this spirit of Antichrist, he calls him the man of Torahlessness, the man of lawlessness, the man of no Torah. And he says that this spirit of no Torah was at work even in the first century. If that's the case in the first century, how much more so today? Listen to the words of Paul. 2 Corinthians chapter 6. Here's what he says. I'm sure you've heard this before. This is the verse we all hear when our parents tell us not to marry an unbeliever. They say, "Do not be yoked with unbelievers. For what partnership have righteousness and," what's the word? "Torahlessness? What fellowship has light with darkness? What harmony has Messiah with Belial?" What has a believer in common with an unbeliever? What is Belial? Belial is an interesting term. It's in biblical Hebrew. If you read the King James, you encounter this term sometimes in the Tanakh. You'll come across the term sons of Belial. Like, for example, when Hannah is praying in the temple and Eli thinks she's drunk and she says, "Don't mistake me for a child of Belial." Now, our modern versions just gloss that over and say, "Don't mistake me for a wicked person. I was praying. I wasn't drunk." So it's this odd term for something wicked. The sages tried to figure this out. What does Belial mean? And they say, you know what? I have a theory on this. This is in the Talmud in Tractate Sanhedrin. One of the sages says, I have a theory on this. Belial is actually two Hebrew words put together. They are the words Beli, which means without, and the word ol, which means yoke. Now, yoke is a rabbinic term for Torah. Accepting the yoke of the kingdom it speaks of taking on the Torah. We see that same term used throughout the apostolic scriptures. The Master says, "My yoke is easy." It's Torah. So Belial, you put it together, you put these two words together, it could be pronounced Belial in Hebrew. Belial means the one without yoke, or, as Paul would put it, the Torahless one. This is interesting. This gets more interesting. It's like a mystery. It gets curiouser and curiouser. In first century literature, like the Ascension of Isaiah, another one that didn't make it into the final cut of the Bible, Belial is called the angel of Torahlessness. In the Sibylline oracles, Belial is referred to quite directly and matter-of-factly as Antichrist. When his name appears in the Hebrew scriptures of the Tanakh, or the Old Testament, the Greek version of those, the Septuagint, simply translates his name with one Greek word, anomia, lawlessness, Torahlessness. This is the name of Antichrist. Torahlessness. I want you to see these things. Because these are like opposites here that Paul's making this point. Do not be yoked together with unbelievers. What partnership of righteousness and lawlessness? What fellowship has light with darkness? What harmony has Messiah with Belial? What has a believer in common with an unbeliever? What agreement has the temple of God with idols? For we are the temple of the living God. He lays these things out as opposites. It's Belial versus Messiah. It's righteousness versus lawlessness. The word lawlessness in the passage is the Greek word anomia, Torahlessness. It's light versus darkness. It's Messiah versus Belial. Messiah, in other words, versus false Messiah. Paul says, what agreement has the temple of God with idols? We are the temple of the living God. Just as God said, I will dwell in them and walk among them. I will be their God. They shall be my people. Therefore, he says, come out from their midst and be separate, says the Lord, and do not touch what is unclean. And I will welcome you. We are the temple of God. As believers, we're the temple of God. We'll just kind of like sustain the metaphor for a little way. If that is so, how are we different? How are we different from the temple in the days of the Maccabees? Look at the laws of Antiochus again. Look at what Antiochus has decreed for Israel. the original abomination of desolation, the original little horn. Here's his laws. You shall profane the Sabbath. You shall change the set times and laws. You shall set up idols. You shall eat unclean animals. You shall not circumcise your sons. You shall forget the Torah. I have a very troubling question around this. This is a question that kind of like bothers me and drives me to do what we're doing. Which of these laws of Antiochus, and remember, he's the bad guy, which of these laws of the abomination of desolation have we failed to keep? Because I'll tell you something, it's only in recent years that we can meet like this. If we, think about this, and just be honest now. If we were meeting in Europe 250 years ago, talking like we're talking right now, what would have happened to us? Okay, how about America 200 years ago? As one studies out the history of religion, world history, you see this disturbing pattern emerge. There is a systematic assault on people of Torah and on the Torah itself. People who choose to live by it. In every generation, it says in the Passover Haggadah, it says, in every generation they rise up against us to destroy us. And it's true. We don't have to look too far back in history to see this. When has it ever been more true than with the Holocaust? And even now, even today, even on this side of the century, we see the rising Muslim hatred for Jews. We see a new anti-Semitism arising and that disguises itself as anti-Zionism or anti-Israelism. We're no exception to the rule. Hear the words of the Master in this regard. When you see, standing in the holy place, the temple, the abomination that causes desolation, spoken of through the prophet Daniel, let the reader understand. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. This prophecy, of course, it has different meanings, but I think it's safe to say that one of them is this. If we are the holy place, if we are the temple of the Holy Spirit, we have allowed this spirit of Torahlessness to be established in our midst. We've opened the doors for the little horn, the new Antiochus, Belial, false Messiah, to enter in and take his stand. Paul says the man of Torahlessness is revealed, the son of destruction, who opposes and exalts himself above every so-called God or object of worship. Let me put it to you very directly. If a Messiah came tomorrow with trumpets and fanfare, and he declared, I am your Messiah, I have come to set you free from the Torah, would we know the difference? Are we prepared for a Messiah that comes proclaiming freedom from God's law? What's the solution? The solution, I believe, is we need to get back to who we really are. We need to get back to our biblical roots, back to the assembly of the apostles. You remember back in the days of the apostles, we were zealous for the Torah. That's what it says. In the days of the book of Acts, the apostles described the believers as many thousands there are among the Jews, James says to Paul. He says, many thousands there are among the Jews who have believed, and they are all zealous for the Torah. Paul tells us in Titus 2:14 that Messiah, he says, Messiah gave himself for us to redeem us from every Torahless deed and to purify for himself a people for his own possession, zealous. There's that word again. Zealous for good deeds, for mitzvot, for commandments. We are to be zealous for God's law. Don't get me wrong here. It's not that we must keep the commandments in order to be saved. That's legalism, right? It's not that we keep the commandments in order to be saved. Salvation is by grace, through faith, that not of yourselves, it is the gift of God, not as a result of works, so that no one can boast. But we are his workmanship, created in Messiah Yeshua for good works, which God prepared beforehand so that we would walk in him. That's the rest of the verse. Ephesians 2, 8 and 10. What are those good works, do you suppose, that God prepared beforehand so that we would walk in them? His commandments. It's not that we must keep the commandments in order to be saved. It's that we keep the commandments because we are saved. Yeshua tells us in John 14:21, he said, "He who has my commandments and keeps them is the one who loves me." The Apostle John tells us in 1 John 2, 3-4, "By this we know that we have come to know him, if we keep his commandments. The one who says, 'I have come to know him,' and does not keep his commandments, is a liar. The truth is not in him." And in chapter 5 of the same epistle, he goes on to say this. He says, "By this we know that we love the children of God, when we love God and observe his commandments. For this is the love of God, that we keep his commandments. And his commandments are not burdensome. For whatever is born of God overcomes the world. And this is the victory that has overcome the world, our faith." The words of the Apostle John. In the book of Revelation, let's talk about the last days for a moment. In the book of Revelation, in the days of the reign of the beast, in the days of the last tribulation and the rise of the Antichrist, we are introduced to, as John just said, those that overcome, the overcomers. And this is how they are described. They are described as, in Revelation 12:17, those who keep the commandments of God and hold to the testimony of Yeshua. Who are these folks? They're people like Judah Maccabee, people like old Matityahu, who said, "Whosoever is zealous for the Torah and maintaineth the covenant, let him follow me."